Hey everyone, this is a piece from Fathom journal, and it's titled Fathoming the Intellectual Revolution of Our Times, quote, Critical Whiteness Studies, end quote, and the Demonization of Israel, by Balázs Berkovits. It's an interview between Berkovits and Alan Johnson. The introduction says, somewhere near the center of the intellectual revolution of our times and to the manner in which it has demonized the Jewish state, Israel, are new ways of thinking about, quote, race, racism, and the couplet oppressor-oppressed that are associated with the concepts of, quote, critical race theory and, quote, whiteness. Whatever the merits or demerits of, quote, whiteness studies for understanding of anti-black racism, quote, whiteness studies has tended to frame Jews and Israel as essentially, quote, white, and so essentially, quote, oppressive, with the result that contemporary anti-Semitism is denied by ideological fiat, granted no place in the related meta-theory of, quote, intersectionality. Quote, whiteness studies often works in tandem with the related notion of, quote, Zionist settler colonialism, end quote, to underpin apologetics or even active support for anti-Semitic jihadists who are redefined as the, quote, progressive resistance of the oppressed, end quote. Fathom spoke with Balázs Berkovits, one of the most thoughtful critics of, quote, whiteness studies, and its role in weakening the fight against the anti-Semitism of our time. Balázs Berkovits warns that through this intellectual revolution, quote, the meaning of, quote, Jew is transformed, taking up all the connotations of, quote, domination. Thus, when, quote, Jew and, quote, white are combined in this discourse, it is the anti-Semitic content that ends up emphasized. In this mixture of a seemingly progressive critique of power and the oldest anti-Jewish stereotypes, it is the progressivism that is erased, end quote. And just to give a look at the Wikipedia for whiteness studies. Whiteness study is the study of the structures that produce white privilege, the examination of what whiteness is when analyzed as a race, a culture, and a source of systemic racism, and the exploration of other social phenomena generated by the societal compositions, perceptions, and group behaviors of white people. Whiteness studies is an interdisciplinary arena of inquiry that is developed beginning in the United States from white trash studies and critical race studies, particularly since the late 20th century, is focused on what proponents, and Wikipedia says bracket who, question mark, and bracket, describe as the cultural, historical, and sociological aspects of people identified as white, and the social construction of, quote, whiteness as an ideology tied to social status. Pioneers in the field include W.E.B. Du Bois, Jefferson Davis as a representative of civilization, published in 1890, and Darkwater, published in 1920. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, 1963. Theodore W. Allen, The Invention of the White Race, 1976, expanded in 1995. Historian David Roediger, The Wages of Whiteness, 1991. Author and literary critic Toni Morrison, Playing in the Dark, Whiteness in the Literary Imagination, 1992. Ruth Frankenberg, White Women, Race Matters, The Social Construction of Whiteness, published in 1993. By the mid-1990s, numerous works across many disciplines analyzed whiteness, and it has since become a topic for academic courses, research, and anthologies. Some syllabuses associate the dismantling of white supremacy as a stated aim in the understanding of whiteness, while other sources view the field of study as primarily educational and exploratory, such as in questioning the objectivity of generations of works produced in intellectual spheres dominated by white scholars. A central tenet of whiteness studies is a reading of history and history's effects on the present that is inspired by postmodernism and historicism. According to this reading, racial superiority was socially constructed in order to justify discrimination against non-whites. Since the 19th century, some writers have argued that the phenotypical significance attributed to specific races are without biological association, and that what is called, quote, race is therefore not a biological phenomenon. Many scientists have demonstrated that racial theories are based upon an arbitrary clustering of phenotypical categories and customs, and can overlook the problem of gradations between categories. Thomas K. Nakayama and Robert L. Krizek write about whiteness as a, quote, strategic rhetoric, asserting in the essay, quote, Whiteness, a Strategic Rhetoric, that whiteness is a product of, quote, discursive formation and a, quote, rhetorical construction. Nakayama and Krizek write, quote, there is no, quote, true essence, end quote, to, quote, whiteness. There are only historically contingent constructions of that social location, end quote. Nakayama and Krizek also suggest that by naming whiteness, one calls out whiteness's centrality and reveals whiteness's invisible central position. Whiteness is considered normal and neutral, therefore, to name whiteness means that one identifies whiteness as a rhetorical construction that can be dissected to unearth its values and beliefs. Major areas of research in whiteness studies include the nature of white privilege and white identity, the historical process by which a white racial identity was created, the relation of culture to white identity, and possible processes of social change as they affect white identity. Bracket citation needed. LondonAntisemitism.com's bio for Balázs Berkovits. Balázs Berkovits was born in Budapest and lives in Tel Aviv. Balázs Berkovits is currently a researcher at the Stephen Roth Institute, Tel Aviv University, and at the Bucerius Institute, University of Haifa. Balázs Berkovits is a member of the editorial board of the journal K, Jews, Europe, and the 21st Century. Berkovits was trained as a philosopher and sociologist in Hungary and France. Berkovits wrote his PhD on the philosophy of Michel Foucault and obtained a Nationalism Studies degree at Central European University, Budapest. Berkovits has published on topics related to social theory, epistemology of the social sciences, and antisemitism. Berkovits is currently working on a study on the reemergence of the, quote, Jewish problem in contemporary works of philosophical, social, and political criticism, as well as on various projects that deal with the relationship between conspiracy theories, critique, and antisemitism. As a journalist, Berkovits occasionally writes about the political and social situation in contemporary Hungary. So here we go. The actual piece. Part 1. On the notion of, quote, whiteness. Alan Johnson asks, let's start with the basic argument you have made about critical whiteness studies, as critical whiteness studies impacts Jewish people, and unpack it. One second. You wrote this in your 2018 article, Critical Whiteness Studies and the, quote, Jewish Problem. Quote, attributing, quote, whiteness to Jews is more than controversial. For attributing, quote, whiteness to Jews, assimilates the most persecuted minority in European history to the dominant majority while downgrading the significance of anti-Semitism, end quote. Berkovits. Perhaps for readers who may not understand this use of, quote, white, not as a neutral descriptor, but as a political or moral category meaning, quote, the privileged, or, quote, the oppressor, we should start there. Let's leave Jews out of it for now and just focus on this, quote, critical usage of, quote, whiteness. How did it get going at all? Did it emerge in academia? And what political meaning does the, quote, critical usage of, quote, whiteness carry as opposed to the descriptive term, quote, white? And Balázs Berkovits says, the discourse on, quote, whiteness began in the United States, where, in contrast to Europe, color and racial classification have always played a significant role. However, as the novel, racial, self-understanding of social groups, and as, quote, race-based critique are gaining ground, as highlighted by, quote, critical race theory and, quote, critical whiteness studies in academia, it has also been exerting an increasingly greater influence in Europe. Critical whiteness studies have been promoted as an activist scholarship. Critical whiteness studies' goal is to question and de-essentialize whiteness, thus reducing some of whiteness's power. That is to say, whiteness is a social construct rather than a biological fact. White is thus a color in and of itself rather than the absence of color. The question, quote, how does whiteness work as a racial norm, end quote, was the central issue of whiteness studies. According to Ruth Frankenberg, one of its founders, their intention was, quote, to displace the, quote, unmarked marker, end quote, status of whiteness, continued inability to, quote, color the seemingly transparent white positionings, end quote. Ruth Frankenberg. Wikipedia says Ruth Frankenberg lived from 1957 to 2007. Ruth Frankenberg was a British-American social scientist and feminist, known for her, Ruth Frankenberg's, pioneering work in the field of whiteness studies. Back to the text. Even in previous critical analyses of racism, Ruth Frankenberg claims, quote, whiteness remains unexamined, unqualified, essential, homogeneous, seemingly self-fashioned, and apparently unmarked by history and practice, end quote. Ruth Frankenberg in Displacing Whiteness. And I'm going to look up Displacing Whiteness. Displacing Whiteness is an edited volume, Essays in Social and Cultural Criticism. I don't know who all is in it, but I'm going to read the description for the book. Displacing Whiteness makes a unique contribution to the study of race dominance. Displacing Whiteness's theoretical innovations in the analysis of whiteness are integrated with careful, substantive explorations of whiteness on an international, multiracial, cross-class, and gendered terrain. Contributors localize whiteness as well as explore whiteness's sociological, anthropological, literary, and political dimensions. Approaching whiteness as a plural rather than a singular concept, the essay describes, for instance, African American, Chicana/Chicano, European American, and British experiences of whiteness. The contributors offer critical readings of theory, literature, film, and popular culture, ethnographic analyses, explorations of identity formation, and examinations of racism and political process. Essays examining the alarming epidemic of angry white men on both sides of the Atlantic, far-right electoral politics in the UK, underclass white people in Detroit, whiteness in, quote, brownface, in the film Gandhi, the engendering of whiteness in Chicana movement discourses, quote, whiteface literature, Roland Barthes as a critic of white consciousness, whiteness in the black imagination, the inclusion and exclusion of suburban, quote, brown-skinned white girls, and the slippery relationship between culture, race, and nation in the history of whiteness. Displacing Whiteness breaks new ground by specifying how whiteness is lived, engaged, appropriated, and theorized in a range of geographical locations and historical moments, representing a necessary advance in analytical thinking surrounding the burgeoning study of race and culture. The contributors to this volume include Rebecca Anna Rude, Angie Chabran, Derner Sessian, Phil Cohen, Ruth Frankenberg, John Hartigan Jr., Bell Hooks, T. Muralid Heron, Chela Sandoval, France Wendance Twine, Vron Ware, David Wellman. Back to the text. And it's still Berkovits speaking. This new approach attempts to de-essentialize, quote, whiteness, while separating whiteness from whiteness's, quote, perceptual meaning as skin tone. This approach does this by treating, quote, whiteness as a historical concept. As a result, it is said that individuals and groups can become white, which acquired through a historically defined process of assimilation/acculturation. Therefore, the deconstruction of the supposedly neutral and essentialized category, quote, white, is often arrived at by writing the social history of, quote, whiteness, the way Italians, Irish, Russians, and also Jews have become white in the United States against the backdrop of the persistent racial discrimination of the black population. Regarding Jews, quote, whiteness was meant to represent the culmination of a historical process that saw discrimination and antisemitism gradually decline in the United States after World War II. Although the increasing number of anti-Semitic incidents over the past 2 decades, and especially after the 7th of October, strongly contradicts the latter hypothesis, even if it is only grudgingly admitted, or not at all, or often classified as a, quote, non-systemic, end quote, phenomenon. And Alan Johnson says, and is the category, quote, whiteness, used by these theorists as part of a binary with, quote, non-white? Can every single person be placed within a binary framework of, quote, whiteness and, quote, non-white? How is, quote, non-white defined? How does it, quote, work? And Balázs Berkovits says, or Berkovits, I think it's Berkovits. That's how they were telling me to pronounce it in the Hungarian to English translator, but I'm not sure. For the last couple years or even decades, we have been witnessing the re-essentialization of, quote, whiteness, with the ubiquity of race talk about white fragility, etc. Within, quote, woke, end quote, discourse, everything can be reduced to race, to racial and ethnic group membership. Individuals are construed as being fundamentally determined by collectives, which are often racially defined. This is how, quote, white privilege, end quote, is acquiring importance in the discourse on social inequalities. The term, quote, white privilege not only expresses inherited social status as unmerited advantage, but it narrowly associates it with skin color. Also, it often signals a kind of original sin, which is why white people in the U.S. and maybe also in Britain are often sent by educational institutions or their employers to persist in training sessions to confess their guilt, owing to their belonging to the white group. The biologization of social difference is a very unfortunate tendency. For example, I believe that the question has never been asked, can a group deemed, quote, white lose its status of whiteness? It should be possible, though, if the socio-historical framework is taken seriously. By the same token, there are limits to the, quote, whitening process, namely that black and other dark-skinned people cannot become white. The theory forecloses the possibility of social integration for blacks, since it is understood in terms of, quote, whiteness. There is an obstacle embedded in the concept. So when social mobility is bound to skin color, or at least when the most important indicator of inequalities is understood in terms of color, it is obvious that the image of social hierarchy that this conception conveys is unidimensional and extremely rigid. Even from the beginning, there has been an inherent tension between two conceptions of, quote, whiteness in, quote, critical whiteness studies. Whiteness can be perceived as either the result of assimilation or an innate reality of skin color, but more often the two are blurred. For example, in Karen Brodkin's so-called pioneering work, on, quote, Jewish whiteness, How Jews Became White Folks, God, I hate that title, 1998, the name, quote, Euroethnics, seems to refer implicitly to skin color, subverting the original thesis according to which, quote, whiteness is a historical construction. I'm going to read the description for How Jews Became White Folks, whose longer title is How Jews Became White Folks and What That Says About Race in America. The fashion identities in the context of a wider conversation. That's a weird sentence. The fashion identities in the context of a wider conversation about American nationhood, to whom it belongs and what belonging means. Race and ethnicity, class, gender, and sexuality are all staple ingredients in this conversation. They are salient aspects of social being from which economic practices, political policies, and popular discourses create, quote, Americans. Because all of these facets of social being have such significant meaning on a national scale, they also have major consequences for both individuals and groups in terms of their success and well-being, as well as how they perceive themselves socially and politically. The history of Jews in the United States is one of racial change that provides useful insights on race in America. Prevailing classifications have sometimes assigned Jews to the white race and at other times have created an off-white racial designation for them. These changes in racial assignment have shaped the ways American Jews of different eras have constructed their ethno-racial identities. Karen Brodkin illustrates these changes through an analysis of her own family's multi-generational experience. She shows how Jews experience a kind of double vision that comes from racial middleness. On the one hand, marginality with regard to whiteness, on the other, whiteness and belonging with regard to blackness. Class and gender are key elements of race-making in American history. Brodkin suggests that this country's racial assignment of individuals and groups constitutes an institutionalized system of occupational and residential segregation, is a key element in misguided public policy, and serves as a pernicious foundational principle in the construction of nationhood. Alternatives available to non-white and alien, quote, others have been either to whiten or to be consigned to an inferior underclass unworthy of full citizenship. The American ethno-racial map, who is assigned to each of these poles, is continually changing, although the binary of black and white is not. As a result, the structure within which Americans form their ethno-racial gender and class identities is distressingly stable. Brodkin questions the means by which Americans construct their political identities and what is required to weaken the hold of this governing myth. It says that Karen Brodkin is a professor of anthropology at UCLA. She is the author of Caring by the Hour and Sisters and Wives, co-edited with D. Remy of My Troubles and Are Going to Have Trouble with Me. Back to the text. Let me read the last sentence I read. For example, in Karen Brodkin's so-called pioneering work on, quote, Jewish whiteness, How Jews Became White Folks of 1998, the name, quote, Euroethnics seems to refer implicitly to skin color, subverting the original thesis according to which, quote, whiteness is a historical construction. This is why Brodkin gets into circular arguments, since it's not clear whether Jews are already white, or at least prone to whiteness because, quote, perceptually white, or, while considered non-white at the beginning, they only acquire this status over the period of a couple decades. Now, with the reessentialization of whiteness, the perceptual meaning of, quote, color is coming to the fore again as skin color, and as something established, fixed, and unequivocal. When authors talk about the color lines separating whites and blacks, color gains a much more literal significance. For if white privilege is mostly skin privilege in everyday situations, see the classic formulation in McIntosh, White Privilege Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of 1989, an article of 1989, that is, being perceived as white, passing as white, then historical deconstruction of whiteness does not really help. For individual Europeans, let them be Irish, Italians, or Jews, but also many Middle Eastern Jews will be perceived as white regardless of social history. So this is referring to a piece by a Peggy McIntosh. There's even a Wikipedia page for it. I'll read the description for this. White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack is a 1989 essay written by Peggy McIntosh. The essay covers 50 examples or hidden benefits from her perspective of the privilege white people experience in everyday life. Themes. McIntosh outlines, quote, invisible systems at work, as well as the main theme of a, quote, invisible pack of unearned assets, examined in the form of a metaphorical knapsack. The essay features 50 of Peggy McIntosh's insights into experiential white privilege, listed numerically. These have been described as, quote, small benefits that white Americans enjoy every day, end quote. Reception. The Atlantic has written that the intention behind the essay was to inspire, quote, self-reflection, enhancing their capacity for empathy and compassion, end quote. It has been described by Vice as one of the most authoritative texts on the subject of white privilege, and the Harvard Gazette have called it a, quote, groundbreaking article, and the most important of McIntosh's academic career. It has been cited as responsible for the mainstreaming of discussion of white privilege, becoming a, quote, staple of discussion about bias, end quote, in society. In 2018, artwork and studies inspired by the essay have become popular in social justice sections of social media such as Tumblr. Influence on education. The essay has become one of the key teaching resources in the study of white privilege in the United States and Canada. In 2016, some New York City public schools assigned the essay to high school students. In 2017, a high school in Caledon, Ontario incorporated the essay in an 11th grade anthropology class. Connor Friedersdorf recommended including the essay in college curricula. Peggy McIntosh's essay inspired, quote, privilege walks, workshops, and other activities to help students identify their privileges. The origin of privilege walks, initially known as, quote, power shuffles, is often attributed to McIntosh in the 1990s. Although McIntosh's essay inspired them, in 2021, Peggy McIntosh denied any association with such practices and emphatically discouraged engaging in them. Quote, I did not invent the exercises, and in fact I urge people not to undertake such exercises. They are too simple for complex experiences relating to power and privilege. I don't know where they originated. They seem to answer a craving for instant one-size-fits-all awakenings. I think they are counterproductive, end quote. Peggy McIntosh. And Wikipedia for Peggy McIntosh says, Peggy McIntosh, born 1934, is an American feminist, anti-racist activist, scholar, speaker, and senior research assistant at Wellesley Centers for Women. Peggy McIntosh is the founder of the National Seed Project on Inclusive Curriculum, seeking educational equity and diversity. Peggy McIntosh and Emily Stile co-edited Seed for its first 25 years. Peggy McIntosh has written on curricular revision, feelings of fraudulence, hierarchies in education and society, and professional development of teachers. In 1988, Peggy McIntosh published the article White Privilege and Male Privilege, a personal account of coming to see correspondences through work in women's studies. This analysis, in its shorter version, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of 1989, pioneered putting the dimension of privilege into discussions of power, gender, race, class, and sexuality in the United States. Both papers rely on personal examples of unearned advantage that McIntosh says she experienced in her lifetime, especially from 1970 to 1988. McIntosh encourages individuals to reflect on and recognize their own unearned advantages and disadvantages as part of immense and overlapping systems of power. Peggy McIntosh's recent book on privilege, fraudulence, and teaching as learning, Selected Essays 1981 to 2019, is a collection of essays published over her career. Okay, back to the interview. I'm going to reread the last sentence that Balázs said, or Balázs Berkovits said. For if white privilege is mostly skin privilege in everyday situations, see the classic formulation in McIntosh, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack of 1989, that is being perceived as white, passing as white, then historical deconstruction of whiteness does not really help. For individual Europeans, let them be Irish, Italians, or Jews, but also many Middle Eastern Jews, will be perceived as white regardless of social history. So far, the relationship between whiteness as a metaphor of dominant status, middle class, mainstream, high volume of educational capital, etc., and whiteness as skin color has not been meaningfully clarified, but we could have the feeling that the analysis falls back on skin color as default whenever the essential nature of the color line has to be demonstrated. So that's part one of the interview. Part two, Jews and, quote, whiteness. Alan Johnson says, okay, an obvious question next, but one many will have. Given Jews have many ethnicities, and many are people of color from the Middle East, North Africa, Ethiopia, how on earth do these theorists justify defining all Jews as, quote, white? Berkovits says, by the same token, you could ask, how on earth can some people think of Israel as a white ethno-state? Well, probably because some of those people have never visited that country, and some of those people have never seen a Jewish person of color, or even if they saw one, they don't consider it as a paradigm case, but maybe just an anomaly. When Jews were still considered a minority in the United States, there were probably not many of them with a darker skin. Since historically most Jews in the U.S. were immigrants or refugees from Europe, they were known to be Europeans. But of course, white supremacists don't take Jews to be white. which mandates their racist attitude, while some left radicals think that they are, quote, too white, that is, part of the oppressive majority. In fact, the case of American Jews could have contributed to a large degree to the deconstruction of, quote, whiteness, precisely because this is a population different from other ethnic whites in so many respects. However, the theoretical drive of, quote, critical whiteness studies, end quote, or rather, critical whiteness studies' politically driven criticism, overruled their primary intention. Coming to terms with the presence of anti-Semitism would have made this kind of theoretical overdetermination based on color difficult to maintain. This is partly the reason why Jews constituted a, quote, this is partly the reason why Jews constituted a bracket or parenthesis epistemological and parenthesis obstacle to that criticism, and received the, quote, white label. This obstacle is clearly expressed by Milton Fry Jacobson, a, quote, whiteness scholar, when he says that some people, and among them Jews, tend to, quote, disavow any participation in 20th century white privilege on the spurious basis of their, quote, parents and, quote, grandparents' racial oppression. Matthew Fry Jacobson, quote, whiteness of a different color, published in 1999. For Matthew Fry Jacobson, Jews are unequivocally white in spite of their history of extreme persecution and the survival of anti-Semitism. Jews are white even if Jews don't accept being white, or a fortiori. According to apparently Matthew Jacobson is a history professor, or a professor of American Studies and History, and professor of American Studies at Yale. Matthew Fry Jacobson is Sterling Professor of American Studies and History. Matthew Fry Jacobson is the author of 8 books on race, politics, and culture in the United States: Dancing Down the Barricades, Sammy Davis Jr. and the Long Civil Rights Era, 2023, Odeta's One Grain of Sand, 2019, The Historian's Eye, Photography, History, and the American Present, 2018, What Have They Built You to Do? The Manchurian Candidate in Cold War America, with Gaspar Gonzalez, 2006, Roots 2, White Ethnic Revival in Post-Civil Rights America, 2005, Barbarian Virtues, The United States Encounters Foreign Peoples at Home and Abroad, 1876 to 1917, published in 2000, Whiteness of a Different Color, European Immigrants and the Alchemy of Race, published in 1998, and Special Sorrows, The Diasporic Imagination of Irish, Polish, and Jewish Immigrants in the United States, published in 1995. Matthew Fry Jacobson also served as creator, writer, and lead researcher for A Long Way from Home, The Untold Story of Baseball's Desegregation. A Long Way from Home garnered a Golden Telly Award in the category of General Television Documentary in 2019. Ongoing projects include Dick Gregory and the Idea of Political Comedy. Along with Patty Limerick, Matthew Fry Jacobson has also hosted Historians Imagine, a monthly webinar devoted to creativity in the historian's craft. Matthew Fry Jacobson's teaching and research focus on race and U.S. political culture, 1790 to present, including U.S. imperialism, immigration and migration, popular culture, civil rights, and the juridical structures of U.S. citizenship, in addition to documentary studies and public humanities. I'm going to see if this piece, Whiteness of a Different Color, comes up. It was published by, it's actually I don't know, it was in quotes, but it's a book, so, Maybe it's an essay. In a series of essays. I don't know. Anyway, it says America's racial odyssey is the subject of this remarkable work of historical imagination, argues that race resides not in nature but in the contingencies of politics and culture. In ever-changing racial categories, we glimpse the competing theories of history and collective destiny by which power has been organized and contested in the United States. Capturing the excitement of the new field of, quote, whiteness studies, and linking it to traditional historical inquiry, Jacobson shows that in this nation of immigrants, quote, race has been at the core of civic assimilation. Ethnic minorities in becoming American were re-racialized to become Caucasian. Matthew Fry Jacobson provides a counter-history of how nationality groups such as the Irish or Greeks became Americans, as racial groups like Celts or Mediterraneans became Caucasian. Matthew Fry Jacobson traces race as a conception and perception, emphasizing the importance of knowing not only how we label one another, but also how we see one another, and how that racialized vision has largely been transformed in this century. The stages of racial formation, races formed in conquest, enslavement, imperialism, segregation, and labor migration, are all part of the complex and now counterintuitive history of race. No, thank you. The stages of racial formation, races formed in conquest, enslavement, imperialism, segregation, and labor migration, are all part of the complex and now counterintuitive history of race. Whiteness of a different color traces the fluidity of racial categories from an immense body of research in literature, popular culture, politics, society, ethnology, anthropology, cartoons, and legal history, including sensational trials like the Leo Frank case and the draft riots of 1863. Back to the text. But then there is a further problem. In this case, it is the theoretician who is tagging people as white instead of observing the actors, the members of ethnic or, quote, racial groups, classifying each other, or coping with the racial hierarchy based on color in the United States, which was completely new to Jewish immigrants, as it was convincingly analyzed by Eric L. Goldstein in his The Price of Whiteness, which goes way beyond mainstream whiteness studies analyses, which he severely criticizes. So it says that Eric L. Goldstein is associate professor of history and Jewish studies at Emory University. Eric L. Goldstein is also the editor of the quarterly scholar American Jewish History. It says Eric L. Goldstein, associate professor, joint appointment in the Department of History and Institute for Jewish Studies, American Jewish History and Culture, Modern Jewish History, American Social and Cultural History, 19th and 20th centuries. Author of The Price of Whiteness, Jews, Race, and American Identity, published with Princeton in 2016. Goldstein's articles include Different Blood Flows in Our Veins, Race and Jewish Self-Definition in Late 19th Century America, published with American Jewish History, 1997, and his dissertation was on Race and the Construction of Jewish Identity in America, 1875 to 1945. And the description for The Price of Whiteness says, what has it meant to be Jewish in a nation preoccupied with the categories of black and white? The Price of Whiteness documents the uneasy place Jews have held in America's racial culture since the late 19th century. The price of whiteness traces Jews' often tumultuous encounter with race from the 1870s through World War II, when Jews became vested as part of America's white mainstream and abandoned the practice of describing themselves in racial terms. American Jewish history is often told as a story of quick and successful adaptation, but Goldstein demonstrates how the process of identifying as white Americans was an ambivalent process, filled with hard choices and conflicting emotions for Jewish immigrants and Jewish immigrants' children. Jews enjoyed a much greater level of social inclusion than African Americans, but Jews' membership in white America was frequently made contingent on their conformity to prevailing racial mores and on the eradication of their perceived racial distinctiveness. While Jews consistently sought acceptance as whites, Jews' tendency to express their own group bonds through the language of, quote, race led to deep misgivings about what was required of them. Today, despite the great success Jews enjoy in the United States, Jews still struggle with the constraints of America's black-white dichotomy. The Price of Whiteness concludes that while Jews' status as white has opened many doors for them, Jews' status as white has also placed limits on Jews' ability to assert themselves as a group apart. Back to the interview. I'm going to repeat that last sentence. No, I'm not. Now those are the, quote, whiteness scholars who reserve for themselves the right to distinguish white from non-white, ignoring or overruling the struggles of the actors involved. But it is simply not the researcher's role to apply a racial label to certain groups. On the contrary, the researcher must try to understand racial categorization as the result of identification and counter-identification, of struggles and compromise, etc. The question is then how, quote, Jewish whiteness, end quote, becomes effective today, and how the application of this label to Jews by whiteness scholars, critics, or activists transforms the way they are perceived. Whiteness has become a metaphor of privileged social position, and a very unfortunate metaphor, since whiteness condenses skin color, social status, and domination, a perceptual aspect, a social aspect, and a critical aspect. It associates skin color, which is a more or less natural attribute, with social attributes of privilege in a context where every type of prominent position in the system of inequalities will be interpreted as, quote, privilege. That is, an unmerited social advantage associated with color and, quote, race. Small wonder that this mixture cannot properly function as a concept, and eventually it does more harm than good. Part 3, Impacts and Exclusions. Alan Johnson says, you write that, quote, Jews are white, you write that the, quote, Jews are white, end quote, claim has meant Jews are, quote, thereby excluded from the multicultural space of other supposedly dominated ethnic groups, end quote. From the perspective of, quote, whiteness studies, you note, once the Jews, quote, gained acceptance in majority culture and society, end quote, Jews, quote, became part of the dominant and oppressive majority, end quote. So what happened to the understanding of anti-Semitism in critical whiteness studies? And Berkovits says, this perspective is analytically disabling because anti-Semitism does not follow the color line. At the same time as Karen Stugner, I have pieces by Karen Stugner on this channel, has pointed out, quote, color and, quote, privilege are the main terms employed to talk about both racism and social inequalities in an intersectional framework. However, whiteness and intersectionality participate in the othering of Jews, and it may yield anti-Semitic consequences. As long as, quote, whiteness is not so much about skin color, although, as we saw, the concept bears a lot of ambiguities. but is rather about the perception of the level of integration of minority groups of European origin. It functions as an interpretive concept. The, quote, process of whitening, end quote, of American Jews, which is supposed to have attained its fulfillment by the end of the Second World War, expresses a successful integration. However, quote, whiteness, in, quote, critical whiteness studies, is also meant to express a position of domination and privilege, thereby becoming a critical rather than a merely interpretive concept. In this sense, white people as a collectivity would benefit from their dominant position in society and are equally complicit in oppression. I believe there are 3 or maybe 4 levels of, quote, Jewish whiteness, end quote, that appear in these discussions, which, however, are not easily distinguishable. The concept progresses from neutralization to criticism, and at last to open accusation of Jews. In the first stage, the interpretive and critical parts of the, quote, white word are still somewhat combined. Here, whiteness is supposed to neutralize Jewishness and prove the inexistence of antisemitism. Jews are no longer counted as a minority group, and it is said that there can be no serious or systematic antisemitism, as it cannot be conceptualized in terms of race and color, neither literally nor metaphorically. In the second stage, white is already only critical. As white is meant to express a position of domination and privilege. Jewish achievement and acculturation are being portrayed as undeserved and unfair privilege. Jews are now seen as members of the white and racist majority, benefiting from Jews' newly gained positions as whites. In a context of enhanced identity politics, where racial belonging, the color line, and talk about white privilege, essentially referring to skin color, are becoming increasingly important. Jews become part of the white and racist majority, profiting from their newly acquired white personality. White means skin privilege, but also economic privilege and social status. In the third stage, Jews are even portrayed as becoming ideologues of white, racist capitalist society who, furthermore, connect with Zionism. For, quote, whiteness scholars, Jews' social mobility occasionally signifies the, quote, betrayal of a genuine minority status, together with the alliance with the capitalist system, the wholehearted identification with white America and the West, and even anti-black and anti-Muslim racism. The concept of, quote, whiteness thus colonizes the, quote, Jew and automatically invites criticism. Under the guise of a critique of power and domination, this rhetoric presents itself as being free of anti-Semitism. However, the, quote, Jew not only reinforces the, quote, white, but as it was shown by David Schraub, becomes the, quote, super white. The meaning of, quote, whiteness is changed by the appendation of the, quote, Jew. Where am I? Sorry, I'm trying to find a description of David Schraub. David Schraub is assistant professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. David Schraub responds here to a recent AAUP statement. By framing accusations of anti-Semitism as generally being predicated on flagrantly absurd premises, David Schraub argues the AAUP letter writers have skipped past the more demanding work of actually responding to the specific game. Sorry. I was reading that as if it was a description, but it's just it's a description for a piece that Schraub wrote. So, but David Schraub is assistant professor of law at Lewis and Clark Law School. Back to the text. But it is especially the meaning of, quote, Jew that is transformed, taking up all the connotations of, quote, domination. Let me repeat that sentence. However, the, quote, Jew not only reinforces the, quote, white, but, as it was shown by David Schraub, becomes the, quote, super white, end quote. The meaning of, quote, whiteness is changed by the appendation of the, quote, Jew. But it is especially the meaning of, quote, Jew that is transformed, taking up all the connotations of, quote, domination. Thus, when, quote, Jew and, quote, white are combined in this discourse, is the anti-Semitic content that ends up emphasized. In this mixture of a seemingly progressive critique of power and the oldest anti-Jewish stereotypes is the progressivism that is erased. Part 4. Whiteness and Israel. You cite Sander L. Gilman on the parallelism of this new way of thinking of Jewish people and new ways of thinking of Israel. Wikipedia says Sander L. Gilman was born in 1944. Sander L. Gilman is an American cultural and literary historian. Sander L. Gilman is known for his contributions to Jewish studies and the history of medicine. Sander L. Gilman is the author or editor of over 90 books. Sander L. Gilman's focus is on medicine and the echoes of its rhetoric in social and political discourse. In particular, Sander L. Gilman investigates the constellation of medical, social, and political discourse that emerge at certain historical junctures. Back to the text. You cite Sander L. Gilman on the parallelism of this new way of thinking of Jewish people and new ways of thinking of Israel. Gilman writes, quote, the trajectory of the image of Israel from the embattled, overwhelmed, rescued fragment of European Jewry to, quote, super Jew, and then to, quote, racist, arch-villain, parallels this cultural tide, end quote. Gilman, i.e. this tale of enriched and secure Jews in the West. Can you talk about how, quote, critical whiteness studies has been reshaping understandings of Israel? Balázs Berkovits says, in fact, when racism and whiteness scholars deal with the question of Israel, racism and whiteness scholars often turn to the theoretically overdetermined concept of, quote, whiteness as it was described previously. Zionist Jews are framed as European white people settling in the Middle East, which already prejudges of their status as colonizers. This means that the features attributed to Zionist settlers originate in their presupposed social and ideological characteristics, condensed in the, quote, white formula, and much less in their actual or past practices, which are always interpreted in the light of their labeling as, quote, white settlers. From then on, the stereotypes associated with whiteness, racism, or the, quote, ethnic state, end quote, will prevail in the interpretations, without further empirical research into the actually existing Israel or Israel's history. In these analyses, the total spurious whiteness frame is preponderant. For example, according to Abigail Bacon, a Canadian racism scholar, a Marxist and post-colonial writer, American Jews had been progressively whitened during their history on American soil until the end of World War II, whereas the whitening of European Jews came about with Zionism. Wikipedia says Abigail Bacon was born in 1954. Abigail Bacon is a Canadian academic. It says, in a protest held in Toronto on July 29th, 2006, Bacon criticized the government of Prime Minister Stephen Harper for supporting, quote, Israel's illegal actions against the Lebanese and Palestinian people, end quote. In a debate held at York University on May 11, 2009, Bacon and Ryerson University professor Alan Sears spoke in support of a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. Back to the text. For example, Abigail Bacon, a Canadian racism scholar, a Marxist and post-colonial writer, American Jews had been progressively whitened during their history on American soil until the end of World War II, whereas the whitening of European Jews came about with Zionism. Quote, the two processes intersected, end quote, asserts Bacon, thereby creating the entity known as Israel. Furthermore, Bacon thinks that the Jews remaining in the European diaspora have been further whitened as a result of the creation of Israel as a white racist state. Others, like Gabriel Pitterberg, Gershon Shafir, and many more, have similar views stemming from very schematic conceptions. Where am I? Trying to find something on him. It says Gabriel Pitterberg teaches history at UCLA and is taught at St. Anthony's and Balliol Colleges, Oxford. His previous books include An Ottoman Tragedy, History and Historiography at Play. He writes for the New Left Review and the London Review of Books. It looks like he might have it looks like he taught at I don't know if he taught at UCLA. It looks like he has some kind of sexual harassment scandal at UCLA. I don't fucking know. Okay. That's Gabriel Pitterberg, Gershon Shafir. Is Gershon Shavir's bio at UC San Diego says, Gershon Shafir received his BA in Economics, Political Science, and Sociology from Tel Aviv University, his MA from the University of California, Los Angeles, and his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He is the founding director of the UCSD Human Rights Minor. Gershon Shafir co-authored Being Israeli, The Dynamics of Multiple Citizenships, published by Cambridge University Press, won the Middle Eastern Studies Association's Albert Hourani Award for Best Work on the Middle East in 2002. He wrote a book called Struggle and Survival in Israel and Palestine, an anthology of 25 life histories, which he co-edited with Mark Levine, which is published by UC Press in 2012. Lessons and Legacies of the War on Terror, From Moral Panic to Permanent War, co-edited with Everett Mead and William J. Aceves, was published by Routledge. Gershon Shafir is currently at work on Israel's settlement policy and international humanitarian law from 1967 to the present. Gershon Shafir's articles have appeared in the American Journal of Sociology, the British Journal of Sociology, the International Journal of Middle East Studies, Theory and Society, etc. Gershon Shafir's major area of interest is comparative and historical sociology, with emphasis on nationalism, ethnicity, citizenship, and human rights. Back to the text. Others, like Gabriel Pitterberg, Gershon Shafir, and many more, have similar views stemming from very schematic conceptions. By asserting that Zionist settlement is a resettlement of a European population, quote, in a land controlled by a colonial European power, end quote, followed by the creation of a sovereign state, or by the seemingly rational interpretive choice of placing it in the wider context of European colonization without further ado, they think that Israel is the result of, quote, white settler colonialism, end quote. Now the problem, that is, the, quote, Jewish problem, emerges in these discussions when the supposedly colonial features of Zionism and Israel are at the same time taken to be Jewish features of whitened Jews. These Jews are white dominators, pursuing Western colonialism and mystifying the world concerning their deeds, relying on Holocaust memory for impunity. The characteristics of the discourse analyzed above point to the linkages and even potential common ground between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Jews as Western, white, privileged, powerful oppressors harks back to anti-Semitic imagery, where it is the, quote, white adjective that makes the only difference. Inserting the, quote, white adjective, the, quote, white label, between Jews and their critique supposedly renders their discourse anti-hegemonic, because now Jews are not criticized/accused as Jews. The presence of the, quote, Jew appears to be neutralized as a result of, quote, whiteness. It is seemingly only their, quote, being white, end quote, that is under critical scrutiny. However, as we saw, it is precisely the, quote, white adjective that liberates and even enhances anti-Semitic talk. And this next sentence is in italics, so I'm going to read it twice. Therefore, it can be established that it is the problematization of Jews and Jews-ascribed characteristics which, with the help of the, quote, white label, qualify Israel as colonial and single Israel out for attack, which shows the importance of analyzing the, quote, white and the, quote, colonial thematic together. Therefore, it can be established that it is the problematization of Jews and Jews-ascribed characteristics which, with the help of the, quote, white label, qualify Israel as colonial and single Israel out for attack, which shows the importance of analyzing the, quote, white and the, quote, colonial thematic together. Part 5. Whiteness and the, quote, Zionist settler colonialism, end quote, theory. Alan Johnson says, let's examine further the link between the notion of, quote, whiteness and, quote, Zionist settler colonialism, end quote. You have written that one impact of the, quote, Jews are white claim is that, quote, Jews can be presented as white dominators in the Middle East, colonizing the autochthonous non-white Arab population. The hell does that mean? Autochthonous? It says autochthonous is indigenous rather than descended from migrants or colonists. By analogy, the color line is introduced into conflicts which have nothing to do neither with with American race relations nor with a European type of colonialism, end quote. Balázs Berkovits. First, it should be mentioned that the definition of, quote, colony serves as the strongest argument against the establishment of a state or other administrative entity. A colony, in the politically charged sense of having resulted from colonialism, and thus to be differentiated from the more neutral term, quote, settlement, ought not to exist by definition, since it was created through land grabs, conquest, and the exploitation, oppression, and frequently the eviction, and even the genocide of the native population. It is therefore illegal and decolonization is necessary. Consequently, a state is destined to be destroyed if historical investigation reveals that state to be a colony on an interpretive level, since it renders it illegitimate on a normative level. As a result, colonialism has come to represent an explicit and morally presumptive rejection of Zionism and the State of Israel. On the other hand, it is by no means clear what Zionism's, quote, colonial nature should mean. Israel was undoubtedly viewed by the left as a post-colonial state upon its founding. There was no, quote, mother country, end quote, helping Israel's establishment. While Zionists didn't conquer any land or displace any population by force until the First Arab-Israeli War in 1948, which was a defensive and even an existential war against the invading forces of Arab countries and Palestinian militias. Nowadays, anti-Zionist detractors have been ecstatic about this allegedly revolutionary colonial, or rather, quote, settler colonial, viewpoint, since they believe it to be the final evidence of the Jewish state's illegitimacy. The writers either treat Israel's contemporary history, which spans from the early days of Zionism to the present, as a whole as a colonial endeavor without giving it any further thought or drawing any significant divisions between different historical periods. Or they explicitly affirm that no distinction should be made between the periods before and after the Six-Day War, as the whole history of modern-day Israel would follow the same logic from the beginning. Indeed, much of post- or anti-Zionist historiography has used the Six-Day War and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank as the foundation for retroactively portraying Zionism's whole history as a colonial endeavor by employing a teleological perspective. Furthermore, this conceptualization has relied on a very broad definition of colonialism, which purposefully blurs the lines between colonization and colonialism, and has extremely loose and flexible requirements for what qualifies as such. Therefore, the inclusion of Israel among the, quote, settler colonial, end quote, states is conceptually and much less empirically directed. First, by the manipulation of the usual binary oppositions, native, settler, indigenous, European colonists, oppressor, oppressed. Second, by the conceptual association of settler colonialism, or the act of settlement, with a so-called fundamental intention of the, quote, elimination of the native, end quote, comprising ethnic cleansing, murder, and even genocide. And third, by seemingly empirical comparisons to other settler colonies, which are at best superficial and far-fetched, and at worst totally factitious. The thought that Israel is inherently genocidal is anchored in the interpretive framework that construes Israel as colonial or settler colonial in the Western style, constantly practicing oppression and apartheid. That Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinians is always assumed. Therefore, there remains nothing to verify when there is an actual conflict. This has become clear after the 7th of October. The accusation was automatically triggered, even when facts on the ground were not known, and there has been no genuine intention of finding out the facts by the accusers, let them be politicians, journalists, or representatives of certain NGOs. And conversely, the genocide committed against Israelis cannot be perceived, let alone recognized, since they are known to be the fundamental oppressors. Alan Johnson says, so the, quote, Jews are white, end quote, claim has become part and parcel of the, quote, Israel is a settler colonial society claim. Yes? Balázs Berkovits says, interpreting Jews in the whiteness frame accomplishes the impossible by a number of conceptual reversals. Jews are white, therefore don't have the status of a minority. Jews have been powerful colonizers in the Middle East and not the most persecuted human group in history. Jews have been profiting from the Holocaust than anything else by making it seem as if it was unique, etc. Jews are seen as accumulating all the dominant positions in Western societies. unjustly vindicating the status of utmost victims, and illegitimately complaining about anti-Semitism, which they even instrumentalize to defend Israel and to denigrate real minorities, like Muslims, what detractors call the, quote, anti-Semitism card, end quote. With respect to Jews, everything is interpreted in the framework of, quote, privilege. Jews' social and economic status, Jews' educational capital, Jews' alleged, quote, skin privilege, end quote, their, quote, Holocaust credit, end quote. Every objective position Jews occupy in the social hierarchy is to be criticized as unearned, unmerited, and even harmful, whereas every grievance, Holocaust memory, anti-Semitism, is tagged as factitious and fake, in need of deconstruction. Jewishness, then, represents a form of, quote, counter-intersectionality, end quote, a sort of theoretically designated enemy, characterized by the combination of dominant positions, all appropriated by, quote, white Jews. If Jews are thus erased as a minority, they are at the same time enhanced as a group of subjugators. They accumulate the traits of domination, whereas intersectional theory is built on the accumulation of structural disadvantages. This perspective transfigures the attacks against Jews as legitimate social critique, leading to the theoretical neutralization of anti-Semitism. This perspective transfigures the attacks against Jews as legitimate social critique, leading to the theoretical neutralization of anti-Semitism. By purportedly using some social scientific concepts and procedures, whiteness and race scholars, as well as other, quote, social critics, frequently implicitly, but occasionally even directly, support a number of anti-Jewish stances that are presented as anti-hegemonic positions. This means that the critique of Jews in Western society is presented as legitimate social critique, stemming not from hostility to Jews, but from a political position, susceptible to being bolstered by rational arguments, the same way as anti-Zionism is taken to be just a political position, which has nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Part 6, the, quote, good Jews of Whiteness Studies. Alan Johnson says, you write that according to the critical whiteness theorist, quote, there are also, quote, good Jews, those whom we perceive as non-white, suffering not only from white privilege as such, but most particularly from their own fellow white Jews, and never with their fellow white Jews, therefore never from anti-Semitism, end quote. Who are these, quote, good Jews, end quote? Mizrahi Jews? Balázs Berkovits says, I was once at a conference in a school of Israeli origin. A self-identified Mizrahi Jew who now lives in Britain and has been for the last 20 years or so, said that he personally never experienced anti-Semitism, only racism, as he has darker skin. Or, he said, what he experienced as a Jew was discrimination because of his darker skin. This means that he was discriminated against as a Middle Eastern, I don't know, I think that's a typo, as a Middle Eastern, as maybe being perceived as an Arab, but never identified as a Jew. Therefore, he concluded from this personal experience of his that there is no anti-Semitism, or that anti-Semitism equals racism. With all due respect to his personal experience, how could one generalize from this? In his solidarity with Middle Eastern people, he maintains that there is no specific racism towards Jews, because it's only about skin color. A further consequence is that Ashkenazi, quote, white Jews cannot experience anti-Semitism/racism, which is plainly absurd. But then, he surely was never perceived as a Jew, maybe because of the stereotype that Jews are white. So what this person and others are saying is simply that they are passing as non-Jews, since they are not white. Curiously, this would be the only instance of passing when you pass as a person of color, in order to not experience a certain type of discrimination, namely anti-Semitism. If this is true, then Jews of color would be spared of anti-Semitism. But obviously, this cannot be true in general, especially not if they are religious, or if they bear any other conspicuous sign of their Judaism. It's more of an illusion or an ideological construct of those people who would want to stand in solidarity with those whom they perceive as truly oppressed. Tracing the color line even inside the Jewish community may have dangerous consequences. The, quote, intersectionality of colors, end quote, in which Jews of color would participate, overrules Jewishness, denies the relevance of anti-Semitism, and may even pinpoint the, quote, white Jew as the culprit, as the global enemy of colored people. In this discourse, Ashkenazim are white, therefore privileged, whereas Sephardic and Mizrahi, quote, Jews of color, are oppressed both in the U.S. and Israel, suffering essentially the same lot as the Palestinians. The message is not only that the division between white and non-white should be relevant in the interpretation of privilege and domination universally, but more importantly, that these phenomena should be conceived exclusively in terms of color. The message is not only that the division between white and non-white should be relevant in the interpretation of privilege and domination universally, but more importantly, that these phenomena should be conceived exclusively in terms of color. The anti-Semitic phenomenon, under its various forms appearing in human history, is completely excluded by this imaginary division of Jewry. Of course, nobody should deny the potential discrimination on the basis of skin color, even in the case of Jews, but this is the only type of discrimination that is mentioned. It surely eclipses the specific features of anti-Semitism, namely that Jews are for the anti-Semites always oppressors, dominators, conspiring against the majority, whereas this is never said of blacks and other minorities of color. In the racist eyes, blacks, Arabs, people of color are always inferior. And on the extreme right, even the European migrant crisis was attributed to a Jewish plot, taken as its ultimate driving force. According to the theory of, quote, the Great Displacement, Jews have a plan of flooding Europe with migrants, thereby subverting European culture, since those people cannot have a plan on their own! Exclamation point. Alan Johnson. Can, quote, anti-Zionist Jews also qualify as, quote, good Jews? What are the entry requirements and who hands out the certificate of good standing? Balázs Berkovits says, there are some Jews who are trying to prove their anti-Zionist credentials because of fear or conformism, but also as a consequence of their genuinely held democratic beliefs, although the image they have of Israel and Zionism is most of the time erroneous or one-sided. Some people attribute this attitude to, quote, self-hatred, but this is too easily and widely applied, referring to the individual psyche, therefore unverifiable. I think that the motives are less psychological than political, or at least they are stemming less from some sort of identity crisis and more from social pressure. As Shalom Lapin has pointed in a recent article in Fathom, Jews are the only ethnic group that is subjected to a, quote, political acceptability test, end quote, which furthermore is ever-changing. Says that Shalom Lapin is professor of computational linguistics. Lapin received his BA in philosophy at York University. I don't know. There's too many. He teaches language or something. He's a linguistics guy who also writes on anti-Semitism. Anyway, as Shalom Lapin has put it in a recent article in Fathom, Jews are the only ethnic group that is subjected to a, quote, political acceptability test, end quote, which, furthermore, is ever-changing, as it was also confirmed by Susie Linfield. Self-avowed Zionists have long been ostracized from intellectual circles in the U.S. that consider themselves, quote, progressive. Perhaps this could be alleviated eventually by the enthusiastic espousal of the two-state solution and the emphatic denunciation of the occupation of the West Bank. But one doesn't need to be a Zionist. It is enough to be a Jew for being questioned concerning his position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And there are no multiple good answers. According to Lapin, there came the period when one had to advocate for one state between the river and the sea, which in practice, of course, would mean the disappearance of the state of the Jews. However, after the 7th of October, the, quote, progressive anti-Zionist position is further radicalized, and now the identification with the Hamas agenda, presented as a pro-Palestinian position, is required. The explicit demand of removal of Jews from this territory became the order of the day. Who would want to be canceled because of a political stance in favor of Israel, especially when one identifies with many items of a, quote, progressive political agenda? Still, most Jews weren't willing to follow. Part 7. The Critique of the Critique. Alan Johnson says, and so, this is a kind of theoretical and methodological package deal, yes? There is, quote, Jews are white, and there is, quote, Israel is a settler colonialist, and there is framework of analysis known as, quote, intersectionality. So Jews, including the Israeli Jews, have been, to use a colloquial expression we have in the UK, quote, done up like a kipper, end quote. Who should people read for critiques of this demonizing package deal? Balázs Berkovits says, perhaps contemporary anti-Zionism can best be described with the help of the term, quote, cultural code. Wikipedia says, cultural code refers to several related concepts about the body of shared practices, expectations, and conventions specific to a given domain of a culture. Under one interpretation, a cultural code is seen as defining a set of images that are associated with a particular group of stereotypes in our mind. This sort of cultural unconscious, which is hidden even from our own understanding, but is also seen in our actions. The cultural codes of a nation help to understand the behavioral responses characteristic of that nation's citizens. The key codes in understanding specific behaviors differentiate between religion, gender, relationships, money, food, health, and cultures. Back to the text. Perhaps contemporary anti-Zionism can best be described with the help of the term, quote, cultural code. What Shulamit Foucault calls, in the wake of Karl Mannheim and Clifford Geertz, a cultural code, and specifically the 19th century anti-Semitic code she unearthed, is a simplistic ideological worldview oriented to criticize the contemporary world. While it is instrumental for federating sometimes very different political stances and agendas. It says that Shulamit Volkov is Professor Emerita of History at Tel Aviv University. Back to the text. As David Nierenberg has recently put it, highlighting particularly the, quote, critical side of the anti-Semitic issue, quote, we live in an age with its own, quote, Jewish questions, an age in which many millions of people are exposed daily to some variant of the argument that the challenges of the world they live in are best explained in terms of, quote, Israel, end quote, end quote. Wikipedia says David Nierenberg is an American medievalist and intellectual historian. David Nierenberg is the director and Leon Levy professor at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. Nierenberg previously taught at the University of Chicago, where Nierenberg was dean of the Divinity School, and Deborah R. and Edgar D. Janota Distinguished Service Professor of Medieval History and the Committee on Social Thought, as well as the former executive vice provost of the university, dean of the Social Sciences Division, and the founding Roman family director of the Neubauer Family Collegium for Culture and Society. He is also appointed to the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, the Center for Middle East Studies, the Joyce Z. and Jacob Greenberg Center for Jewish Studies. David Nierenberg is notable for his landmark analysis in 2013 of anti-Judaism as a constitutive principle of the Western tradition, and his argument for a longue durée approach to historical understanding, a queer about-face from the methodological approach taken in his 1996 work, Communities of Violence, Persecution of Minorities in the Middle Ages. David Nierenberg has a particular interest in Christian, Jewish, and Muslim thought in medieval Europe. In 2004, he was elected to the American Philosophical Society. Back to the text. The task is to map the anti-Zionist cultural code enmeshed with contemporary social and political critique. The study of the ideological structure of present-day anti-Zionism as cultural code invites a multifaceted approach to examine in detail the interplay between the critical epistemological aspects present in today's activist, quote, new academy, end quote, and the socio-political and also moral aspects of political, academic, and civil rights activism, resulting in today's uninhibited anti-Semitic anti-Zionism. The emergence of contemporary radical forms of anti-Zionism as cultural code can be linked, on the one hand, to a number of theoretical choices in critical social science, which lowered its epistemological level. Some of these were analyzed by Robert Fine, Philip Spencer, Moishe Pistone, Danny Traum. I don't know who Danny Traum is. I'll look him up. Karen Stugner, Ingo Elba, Marcel Stutzler, David Hirsch, and others, and which determine the outlook of the, quote, new academy. This outlook is paired with a certain common practice and, quote, ethos of critique, which has largely diverged from rationally founded critical theories based on social science striving for objectivity and or Enlightenment philosophy. For example, quote, critical whiteness studies and, quote, critical race theory, heirs to a once respectable sociology of race, are now infused with identity politics and label Jews as, quote, whites. Other disciplines which are heirs to, quote, post-colonial theory, such as settler colonial studies. Clearly follow a political agenda that they call, quote, liberatory, largely focusing on Israel to the detriment of research and empirical findings. On the other hand, anti-Zionism as a cultural code is political, insofar as it is both an extremely narrow and dogmatic perspective on the world and a broad ideological toolkit, or a surface of projection of ideas that are not organically related to it. It functions as a theoretical shortcut to the understanding and critique of, quote, imperialism, quote, global hegemony, etc., and it serves as a common denominator for groups intending to promote various, quote, progressive agendas, or for groups and individuals who are just trying to act in conformity with the, quote, righteous opinion. According to the London Center for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Danny Traum is a sociologist and researcher at CNRS in France. Danny Traum leads the, quote, Jews in Europe seminar at the École des Hautes in Sciences Sociales and teaches at the University of Lausanne. Deputy editor of the magazine Qu'est le Juif? Europe, I don't know how to say it, this is Jews, Europe in the 21st century, is what I know what it says, but I don't know how to pronounce it. Danny Traum has devoted several books to Jewish politics. The Promise and the Obstacle, The Radical Left and the Jewish Problem, published in 2007, and A Political Theory of Jewish Survival, France Without Jews, published in 2019. His latest work, L'état d'exil, The State of Exile, Jews, Europe, Israel, is devoted to the nature of the State of Israel. Thank you so much for listening.